Western culture is collapsing faster than Baradur on a bad ring day, if you know what I mean, with modern writers torturing us Morgoth style with a never-ending orc rush of meaningless slop. Detritus seemingly designed to demoralize and subvert the ideas of great men. And when the culture starts choking on its own fumes, that means it's time to revisit those great ideas and great men. So in this video, I'm arguing what many already believe, that J.R.R. Tolkien was a prophet whose seminal work stands next to Beowulf, King Arthur, and yes, the Bible in significance. So let me ask you, when I say prophet, do you imagine a robed guru sitting crisscross applesauce style in a cave, talking out loud and hearing the voice of God in his head in response, like it's any old conversation, just with a multi-dimensional entity picking up the phone? Is that what you imagine? Probably not. You probably assume, like me, that an actual honest-to-God prophet may receive divine messaging through means more mysterious, like an intense experience, intense study, or an intense round of honest self-reflection, or D, all of the above. You may notice that these are all individual phenomena. They do not manifest outside of the prophet's own perception. That, of course, makes it impossible for the rest of us to determine who is a proper prophet and who just claims to be so. Or is it impossible? You see, prophets are metaphysical intermediaries, conduits through which a divine intelligence may communicate wisdom. In other words, there's an expressive element to being a prophet. You're not just a prophet because God spoke to you, man. No, you're a prophet because you bring back wisdom from the encounter. Wisdom beyond that which normal geniuses could manage. Moses, Christ, Buddha, the kind of spiritual figures you'd expect. And though prophets normally have an Abrahamic bent, who's to say this wisdom isn't sourced from the universe itself, some other metaphysical entity, a collective consciousness network, or something else beyond reckoning or articulation? Oh hey, by the way, big ups to my main man, the Eternal Cosmic Turtle, for helping me through that one breakup. Wisdom comes from many places. Well anyway, that's my working definition. Prophets are storytellers, capable of expressing a level of wisdom through their narratives that geniuses and mere writers cannot. In fact, you can separate all writers into one of three buckets based on this premise. Writers are technicians. These are the 98% of authors who are creatively talented enough to make something interesting out of a plot-based premise, but don't possess the depth of thinking or expression to create something that leaves a thematic impact, something with moral heft or perspective-bending wisdom. Writers can be idiots or they can be brilliant, capable of pumping out commercial bestsellers that will nonetheless fade quickly from the cultural consciousness. They don't use the same mental and emotional circuitry that geniuses and prophets use when they generate narratives. That I am sure of. They're accessing something lesser, something superficial, something purely of the mind, and yes, the near total majority of modern writers fall into this bucket because they friggin' suck, man. Look, as long as there's been writing, there's been terrible writing, and that's just kind of the way it goes in any creative medium. A talent pyramid with a handful of gems at the top of Slop Mountain. Trust me, there was plenty of crap writing back then too, it's just bad millennial writing is a special kind of intolerable. Vapid, sarcastic, always seeking to subvert rather than understand, and too stupid to do either. Anyway, those are writers. Now geniuses are the great minds of literature that you're already familiar with. Twain, Dostoevsky, Orwell, Shelley, and you're familiar with them because their stories carry uniquely deep insights, typically about human nature. They combine top-of-the-scale creative talent, impressive intellectual capacity, and meaningful life experiences that give them a deeper perspective. When geniuses express themselves creatively, they're not just putting together a plot like a puzzle. They're taking the bits of pure wisdom that they've learned through experience and rumination and constructing a story that isolates those ideas so the reader can understand them better, without requiring the same life experiences as the author. Geniuses can do this using the full swath of literary devices like figurative language. In a way, then, writers think, but geniuses see. Prophets are rarer still. They're geniuses who specifically target the biggest picture ideas, the most difficult themes to articulate, themes that intersect the metaphysical and are connected to aspects of existence ultimately unknowable. As such, the prophet can't think his way through a narrative the way a mere writer can, because there is no way to think yourself into divinely delivered wisdom no matter how hard you try. Divine inspiration shows up when it wants, often during a period of distress. Prophets are rare for two reasons then. One, you need a person who has the capacity and temperament to receive divine inspiration, and two, you need something unusually intense to open up the man-to-God link. This metaphysical connection is beyond thought or imagination, which is why I say that prophets are conduits, not just thinkers. And that's what I'm arguing Tolkien is, a conduit for divine visions, in communion with something above us in the hierarchy, and the author of a pro-Western civilization gospel that, frankly, seems holy to me. J.R.R. the Good Doctor was a genius, that much is beyond argument. It's widely accepted. He helped edit the Oxford Dictionary. He was a master linguist and a compelling, if idiosyncratic, lecturer. Oh yeah, and there's the books. But the man also needs respect for his research into Beowulf, one of Western civilization's foundational narratives. More on that later, but for now it bears repeating that Tolkien clearly had the creative capacity to express high-level wisdom like a prophet must. But that's only part of the arithmetics here, because again, you need some kind of triggering event to open up the man-to-God link, and oh wait, yeah, that's right. Tolkien fought in in World War I, endured the brutalities of trench warfare, saw his brothers get torn apart during the Battle of the Somme, and was sent home after contracting a severe bacterial illness spread by lice. If prophets are forged out of intense experiences, Tolkien had a compendium of those due to his exposure to war and death. He may not have heard the voice of God over the artillery shelling, but he certainly received some kind of high-level wisdom that made it to his works. He's even confirmed such, admitting that his time in the war had a major influence on his narrative building. And then there's his sense of faith. J.R.R. was a dedicated Catholic and a lover of his home culture, Western culture. The man was religious, and though he strove to keep religious allegory out of his works, even criticizing his good friend C.S. Lewis for relying on it in his own excellent narratives, he also admits that there's no removing his spiritual thinking from Lord of the Rings. He's not trying to hide it, people. J.R.R. Tolkien states that LOTR is a fundamentally religious work of art. Western civilization has produced the best storytellers in history, and man, come at me if you want to take on this list. It's settled literary science. And there's one narrative theme that sings through the most important Western works of literature. We're talking the Bible, the King Arthurian tales, Beowulf, and yes, Lord of the Rings. That theme? The return of the good king. Oh, whoa, wait, where have I heard that one before? It's not a difficult theme to understand. It's central to every text it's featured in. The rise of the good king is a critically important idea in Western culture. In every text it's featured in, the good king's return heralds the end of a dark age and the rise of a golden era of prosperity. This holy theme is not written into stories for fun. It is brandished as a moral concept, the belief that orderly civilization can preserve itself by identifying the good king and getting him to the top of the hierarchy, where his courage and wisdom can push encroaching evil back. It is a universal cycle in these narratives and in reality. Strong men of old, our glorious ancestors, create a society characterized by beauty and order. Over generations, this greatness fades, and opportunistic chaos, always half slumbering, reaches out with black tendrils and threatens again. The good king is found under duress, and his return signals the beginning of the end for evil. Battles still need to be fought, but the outcome is settled. Order prevails. This theme is clearly presented in Lord of the Rings and in Beowulf, perhaps the second most important text in Western civilization behind the Bible. We don't know who wrote Beowulf, and we don't know how long ago it was written, but it's been around for over a millennium, and it's likely the single biggest literary inspiration for Lord of the Rings. And you know, that's not really a surprise when you recall that Tolkien was a big-time bona fide Beowulf scholar who greatly influenced our modern understanding of the story. Specifically, he was one of, and maybe the only, scholar that viewed Beowulf as a proper poetic elegy for its titular hero, filled with, and I quote, large symbolism. In other words, Tolkien could interpret the big-picture themes baked into a 1,000-year-old narrative that his merely intelligent colleagues couldn't. Again, we see the natural capacity to understand wisdom that others cannot even recognize. Prophetic, indeed. In Beowulf, the Golden Hall of J.R.R. is besieged by the demon Grendel. In Lord of the Rings, the White City of Minas Tirith is besieged by the Dark Lord Sauron. In Beowulf, J.R.R. falls under the shadow because it no longer has the quality of men needed to repel evil. In Lord of the Rings, Gondor is declining in similar fashion, with weakness and doubt threatening to undo the world of men. In Beowulf, evil is righteously destroyed by the arrival of a kingly man, Beowulf, who uses courage, faith, and martial prowess to do so. He becomes his people's king and the nation flourishes. In Lord of the Rings, Aragorn leads the Gondorians and Rohirrim against Sauron and provides an opening for Sam and Frodo to obliterate the ring. He then rises to the throne, and Middle-earth enjoys a sustained period of peace and prosperity. The parallels are obvious. Tolkien is deliberately drawing from the deepest themes and large symbols that Western writers have managed. One last quick point, then we'll move on. Why is this thematic concept, the return of the good king, so foundational? Why is it tied to Western writing so tightly? Now remember that us serfs lived under kings for centuries, and so we got a real up-close and personal look at the difference between a good king and an evil one. For some peasant farmer, it was the difference between living peacefully and having a red-hot poker shoved up your ass or something to that effect. The noble you lived under had a pretty big impact on the trajectory of your life, in other words. Western writers have therefore created narratives to help society grapple with this problem, the who should be king problem. These are narratives that illustrate the traits and deeds of a proper king, perhaps to guide Western societies into picking the right leaders. We know prophets by their works, pinnacle examples of expressed wisdom in narrative form. We know that one of the deepest, most important themes in literature is the rise of the good king. We know it's a central literary theme because it lies at the heart of Western Lit's foundational texts. And we know Tolkien was inspired to expand on this theme and translate it for a contemporary audience. So we have two questions here. 1. Does Lord of the Rings express a uniquely deep level of wisdom? And 2. How likely is it that this wisdom is derived from something greater, potentially divine? Well, the first question is easy to answer. That's a clear yes. LOTR is worthy of sitting next to the Arthurian tales and the Bible in richness of depth and moral wisdom. Put aside the long-lasting cultural impact that's still permeating with momentum more than 70 years after it was published. So it's at least a work of genius, but put that aside. Instead, consider the concept of subcreation, a term invented by Tolkien himself. Subcreation is the act of creating a secondary world that reflects the realities and characteristics of the primary world it is created in. Put another way, during subcreation, the person at work, the author in this case, is inspired by the truth of reality to make something that reflects that reality. According to Tolkien, every writer making a secondary world wishes in some measure to be a real maker, or hopes that he is drawing on reality, hopes that the peculiar quality of this secondary world, if not all of the details, are derived from reality or are flowing into it. Dude is clearly articulating something metaphysical here, that we are driven to create because we spring from a creative force and are therefore inspired to continue the creative cycle. Tolkien believed his own writings, including Lord of the Rings, were deliberate attempts at subcreation. He believed earnestly that the rich, detailed world of Middle-earth and all of its mythology, geography, history, and lineage were but an image of the reality we exist in, flowing from reality and therefore an evocation, a manifestation, a variation of reality itself. To Tolkien, subcreation is an act of exaltation. It is the manner in which we further the Creator's mission here. We are all capable of it too, even if we aren't aware of what we're doing when engaged in subcreation. So let's bring it all together before we make the final argument. Tolkien is a uniquely brilliant verbal intellect. He's a uniquely talented creative visionary. He's a man of deep, uncompromising faith. He's a man who lived through many intense experiences, including witnessing war and death. He's a man who dedicated his life to understanding narratives and the big picture wisdom they carry. He's a man who posited the idea of subcreation, the act of mimicking God's creative processes to create a variation of God's reality. He's also a man who deliberately set out to articulate the deep themes repeated in Western literature and perhaps Western religion, using his unique powers of expression to do so. Now let's be real, if you're trying to assess who is most capable of receiving and expressing divine wisdom, most capable of being a prophet, you're probably looking for a person who embodies the traits on this list. Now, I've made the case of Tolkien as a potential prophetic vessel, but to what extent is the wisdom in LOTR actually divinely derived? How can you say that it's wisdom taken from God himself? Obviously, that answer is unknowable. And Tolkien, of course, never claimed to commune with God or any other supreme entity for that matter, so why claim he's a prophet in the first place? He wouldn't claim it. Well, other than to produce spicier YouTube content, relatively speaking, I can't help but think that the overarching message in Lord of the Rings is indeed a holy one. And what does that mean? Well, to be holy is to be of God, of the same stuff, aligned in the same direction, vibrating with the same energy, vibing on the same wavelength, man, if you know what I'm talking about. To be holy is to be connected to the Supreme Being through mechanisms we aren't meant to understand. And if you conceive of the Almighty as a primal force of order, of creation, of benevolence, then LOTR is one of man's most ambitious attempts to subcreate something that reflects God's own moral framework, using a masterful narrative that evokes Western literature's most cherished, most central themes. Holy sh*! You don't have to call him a prophet. I will. You don't have to. But J.R.R. Tolkien is more than your typical genius. Writers think, geniuses see, and prophets feel. And you don't subcreate a world like Middle-earth without great depth of feeling. It's a world with clear, admirable moral precepts, and they arrive to us readers as self-evidently true. Aragorn is a paragon of moral masculinity. Sauron and the orcs are destructive forces of chaos and self-evidently evil. They don't need to be humanized because orcs don't carry the same civilizing instincts as humans. They are evil because of what they do and what they are. Tolkien's moral framework within Middle-earth seems to reflect a moral framework we all accept without debate. And anyone who's got a problem with that, well, they can take a long Uruk hike through Gorgoroth, you witless worms, and keep them forked tongues in your mouth. and Lord of the Rings may be a warning to the West of what happens to high civilization as generations stray further and further from the strength of their ancestors. Here, in this reality, it's a decline that plays out over generations and is therefore nearly imperceptible to most people. But the lovely thing about secondary worlds is that we can manipulate time as we please, fast-forwarding or rewinding to the important events. Lord of the Rings shows us a world at a crossroads. Will civilization be swallowed up by encroaching evil in the form of Sauron's legions? Or will it discover its ancient holy strength, made manifest in the form of Aragorn and guided by Eru's servant Gandalf? Of course, we know the answer to that one. The Fellowship triumphs. C.S. Lewis once gently chided his friend for authoring a fantasy that was good beyond hope. But that rather is the point, isn't it? Tolkien modeled Middle-earth after what he must have believed about this Earth, that God's creative mission and goodness are synonymous, inextricable from each other. And in Lord of the Rings we are shown in narrative form how Middle-earth's version of God, Eru and his servant Gandalf, are on the side of man and Middle-earth's mortal races, most directly by protecting man's greatest champion in Aragorn. This being the way things are arrayed in Lord of the Rings, how could the outcome be in doubt? Tolkien's indefatigable optimism is absolutely one of my favorite aspects of LOTR. In Middle-earth, Gandalf doesn't cast spells. He affirms the will of Eru, which is implaceable even by the strongest evils. When the Balrog rises from the Moirian depths, Gandalf shields the party by telling the fell Maiar that he cannot pass and that the dark fire will not avail him. These are not incantations, but reminders that God's will is both opposed to evil and final. It is the ultimate affirmation in one's faith in a good higher power. Good beyond hope? Well, perhaps, but not without purpose. And perhaps we can summarize it from there, one more time through the mind map. Prophets are gifted storytellers, and we recognize them by the unusually insightful stories they create. Prophets are partly born, partly made. They're born with intellectual and creative gifts, and they're exposed to intense experiences that deepen their perspective. Tolkien possessed a rare combination of verbal and creative capacities, high-impact life experiences, World War I, a thorough understanding of Western writing and narrative form, and the ambition to tackle foundational literary themes that may intersect with the metaphysical. Tolkien derived a great deal of inspiration from other foundational Western works, all of which share a primary theme: the rise of the good king and downfall of evil in the process. Tolkien also recognized that Lord of the Rings is a subcreation, a secondary world in which he is attempting to reflect what he believes about reality, using his unique abilities as a storyteller. And finally, Lord of the Rings is an optimistic warning to the West, articulating the inevitable cycle of high civilization declining over time, only to be rejuvenated when the noble king and his allies return to stomp out evil again, typically with divine assistance. Now, I don't know, maybe I'm going overboard ascribing divine influence to the good doctor's genius, but there's no doubt at all that Lord of the Rings is J.R.R. Tolkien's gospel. And I'm curious if anyone out there feels the same way I do about Tolkien and his works. Let me know in the comments if you do, or if I'm going too far bringing the metaphysical into his magnum opus. Anyway, thank you for watching, and please hit that subscribe button before you hit the door. Later, friends.